Welcome to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers Podcast. Each episode will bring you conversations from business leaders and up-and-coming stars in the commercial real estate industry in Canada. Our guests will share their unique career journeys, passions, and advice on what it takes to be successful in this industry. This podcast is brought to you by Highview Partners, connecting people who perform in Canadian real estate.
I'm your host, Richard Costello, and today I'm pleased to introduce Anthio Yuen. Anthio is Director of Research Services and Strategy at GWL Realty Advisors. Anthio is responsible for the organization's market research and investment strategies across Canada. His primary responsibilities include portfolio construction and analytics, market research and forecasting, investment and development due diligence, and asset strategy. An overarching focus for Anthio and the team is the identification of market trends that influence the investment decisions of GWL Realty Advisors clients and managed property funds. Anthio has a master's degree in urban planning and development from the University of Toronto and an undergraduate degree in urban geography from Simon Fraser University. Anthio is actively involved in NAIOP Vancouver and is president for 2021. Anthio, a big welcome to you and thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. This is a great program, so happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anthio. So you're the first guest on our podcast to work in a research-focused role. And outside of brokerage and specialized consulting groups, the research function is typically only held within institutional real estate companies. And considering most of these groups are based in Toronto, I'd say you have a fairly unique role in Vancouver. So perhaps you can kick us off by explaining why GWL Realty Advisors places such emphasis on their internal research.
I think to answer that question, it's worth going over first who GWL Realty Advisors is and what we do as an organization. So for GWL Realty Advisors, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of the Great West Life Co. And we're what's known as a real estate investment manager, meaning that we invest on behalf of clients such as pension funds, institutional investors, as well as our own life insurance accounts. So I think we collectively own about 26 billion in assets under management globally and about 14 in Canada, which makes us one of the larger groups in this space. So in terms of our client base, it's quite diverse, but a common focus is the need for longer term stability in terms of their investments. So this means cash flow stability. This means longer term views on their return expectations and really cash flow from real estate to pay for future liabilities in the case of pension funds or the life insurance policyholders. And this is where the importance of research comes in because there's such a rigorous application of investment decisions and such high priority placed on how and where they invest. We come in to advise them on things like economics, capital markets, property fundamentals, and really what drives their investment decisions long term. And this could range from macro views on what's happening with Canadian cities to more tactical and asset specific investment strategies.
For anyone interested in exploring this area of the business, this year aside, what does a typical work week look like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our work tends to fit around three main buckets, maybe to start off with. So it's longer term trends and strategy. The second one being cities, markets, and economies. And the third one being growth in the form of acquisitions, development, as well as the placement of capital. So our work can range, really from heavy statistical analysis, working with data, to more qualitative research such as interviews, surveys, lit reviews. But in terms of the day-to-day, our team is unique in the sense that we don't necessarily produce regular quarterly reports or deliverables like other research focus groups or economic research groups would do. So our approach is really project-based and client-focused, meaning the weeks and days are quite varied. So for example, and this is really what's been happening the last couple of months through COVID, is say we're working on a longer term investment strategy for a client. That could take weeks or months or even on an ongoing basis through a couple of quarters. And that includes working with internal groups, external groups, as well as liaising with our clients. And for something like that, it's more like a true consulting project where we start with a specific topic, come up with the question, decide on how to approach that question, and then develop some sort of a analysis framework or framework for decision making and outcomes. And then on the other hand, say we get pulled into an acquisition opportunity, we really have to mobilize and pivot relatively quickly. And that include really trying to do a deep dive on the market and that specific node right away, and then spend a couple of days or even just a couple hours providing some sort of opinion on that investment opportunity and that market.
Would you mind giving us an insight into Anthio in the early years and what made you want to explore urban geography in your undergrad?
Yeah, I'd say my background is pretty standard and normal. So born and raised in Metro Vancouver in the suburbs, relatively tight-knit family. We were a pretty big sports family growing up. So myself, my older brother, we did pretty much every sport under the sun. As for my parents, my dad was an accountant and my mom was a food writer. So I guess, maybe relaying into what I do now, I definitely got a bit of a mix of both the analytical and creative side from both of them. So because I tend to do a lot of writing at work, my mom and I definitely relate closely on that front and talk about just the kind of art and science of putting together a really well written piece. And then obviously talking to my dad just about general things around finance and investments. I think going on to your question about my focus in undergrad. So I think like many university students in their first couple of years, you don't really have a clear sense of what you want to do. But for me, and I think some of your other speakers on this group have said that they have an interest in buildings, architecture, the creative process of city building, and really how cities function. And for me, I was definitely along that lines. And it wasn't until third year when I took two classes which were somewhat formative for me and really launched my interest in urban studies and urban geography. But the first one was a course which really focused on city rankings and global cities. So in this case, it's like what drove the growth of Paris compared to London, compared to Tokyo, compared to Hong Kong, and how capital flowed in and among these cities, and as a result of that, how that influenced the local real estate landscape and the local economy. The second one was a course on economic geography, and it was such a good course that I actually have the textbook sitting on my shelf in my office. And it looked at really the geography of capital. So things like supply chains, logistics, globalization. And when I read the book, and even to this day, when we talk about industrial real estate, I can almost kind of visualize the flow of goods and capital moving across cities and ports and things like that. And those two courses were really formative in terms of setting the stage for me to focus on, a deeper dive into that subject area.
And I guess what was your motivation to pursue a master's, and how did you get your start in the industry then?
I think when I was wrapping up my third and fourth year at Simon Fraser, I didn't necessarily have a clear picture of what I wanted to do career-wise, but I knew early on the limits of my undergrad alone in terms of job prospects. I knew at that stage I wanted to be in some sort of a research consulting development related role, and I knew that postgraduate studies was probably the best path for me to really improve my career prospects. So when I graduated from undergrad, I definitely wasn't one to take off a year to travel or discover myself. So I applied for grad school right away. I figured I might as well get over with it while I was still flexible in terms of where I could live and also in being in the right mindset to study. So I applied to a few different schools. I wanted to stay in Canada. And luckily enough, University of Toronto, as well as a few other schools, accepted me. So this is University of Toronto's Urban Planning and Development program. And because of how quickly it went, I really went from cap and gown at Simon Fraser to packing my bags, hopping on a plane, and then really arriving on the other side of the country. The experience at U of T was fantastic. In hindsight, there were a couple of other schools that I could have also gone to, as I mentioned. But I didn't understand how significant Toronto was at that time, just from a global stage, from a real estate perspective. So obviously, being the largest city in Canada, you have a really good business network, especially within the real estate industry. And also being on the eastern part of Canada, I was able to do some quick weekend trips to some other cities or even some longer days. So I went to Montreal, Quebec City, Ottawa, New York, Chicago, and that really allowed me to understand the kind of the cities that were all along the East Coast, which I would have never had exposure to living in Vancouver. And also, perhaps coincidentally or serendipitously, because I work at GWL Realty Advisors, we're head office in Toronto. We have a significant portfolio in Toronto. We continue to invest actively in Toronto. I really do feel that Toronto is somewhat of a second home for me, having lived there for a couple of years. So, with a good Vancouver base and a good Toronto base, both in terms of friends and networks, it really does feel like a second kind of home whenever I do travel there, and I do go there quite a bit.
And how did you get your start in the industry then after graduating? Was it ever an option to stay in Toronto?
So, given the large base of family in Vancouver, and given I was born and raised here, I always had the intention of going back to Vancouver. I did have a couple of internships and job opportunities in Toronto, but I really wanted to place my roots back in the Vancouver area. So, unfortunately, I graduated in 2009 just as the global financial crisis was well underway. I knew I didn't want to be in a traditional public sector role like a city planner. So I was actively looking at development and consulting roles. Unfortunately, as a lot of people remember, 2005, 2006, 2007, there was just such a bevy of those types of jobs around. And then during the global financial crisis, as credit and development activities stopped, a lot of those jobs pretty much disappeared. Luckily enough, my parents were actually downsizing as a result of their youngest son moving out of out of the city and kind of coming back. And the realtor at that time turned out, it just so happened to be an old friend of mine from high school. I mentioned that I was back and looking for work, and she asked me what I wanted to do and put me in touch actually with somebody who she knew that worked in research at one time at a company called DTZ Barnaky, which is a brokerage in Vancouver. Luckily enough, a couple of weeks later, they actually had a job opportunity, which I applied for, interviewed, and luckily enough, I got the job. And that was really my first job after I finished from University of Toronto. In that role, DTZ was looking for someone to cover market research and property market analysis across Metro Vancouver, so office, industrial, retail, multifamily. So I did that for a couple of years, and it was a really good foray into that industry. And then after that, I made the move into CBRE, which was another brokerage, to lead their Metro Vancouver research group. A little bit of a larger team, but in a similar role where we were advising clients on what was happening across property markets in Metro Vancouver. That was a great role just because it was fast paced. We got exposure to a lot of different clients on both the leasing and the investment side. And because I was leading a couple of different teams, I did get really good working knowledge of a variety of different asset classes. So deep dive into the office markets, deep dive into retail, really good understanding multifamily, industrial as well. And in terms of my transition to GWLRA, I wasn't really actively looking for a change. But because GWLRA was working with a major BC based pension at the time, they were looking for somebody to support their research function based in Vancouver. So, given that it was a national role looking at research strategy across Canada, because it was Vancouver based, and also because we were working directly with clients on their investment decisions, it was a really tough decision, but obviously the right one to join GWLRA. And I think I took a look at my start date, and time flies because it's been 9 years at GWL in 2021.
How does the research role differ in the brokerage environment compared to working for a group like GWL Realty Advisors?
I really like this question, Richard, because there's not, in my perspective, a lot of transparency in terms of the differences, but there are very significant differences between brokers research as well as the institutional side. So given that I was on both, I kind of have a bit of a ability to kind of cross and compare. And I think for brokerage, you do have the responsibility of producing primary market data, vacancy rates, listings, absorption, rents, and things like that. But also because you have a wide variety of clients, both on the leasing side and the investment side, you're definitely more focused on macro and top level trends, say in downtown office markets or within industrial distribution and logistics. And because there is a large number of clients and a large number of brokers, there's also a regular pace of reporting, such as quarterly reports or regular updates that you have to produce. On the institutional side, because we work with a number of capital sources, but mainly a smaller group of investors, we tend to focus more on investment objectives and outcomes from the research versus necessarily the research themselves. So I guess this is mainly going back to maybe my title of research and strategy, where research is more about the collection and dissemination of market information on one end, and the strategy is actually turning those insights into some sort of a actionable or pragmatic investment decision.
Are you looking to join an industry association that connects you to the people, knowledge, and resources you need to advance your professional goals? The National Association of Industrial and Office Properties, better known as NAIOP, provides advocacy, education, and business opportunities by connecting members in a powerful North American network in the commercial real estate development and investment industry. To learn more about NAIOP and find out how you can become a member of your local chapter, visit naiop.org.
Well, getting into your world of research and data, according to the figures in the Decade in Review report, GWL Realty Advisors has 14.4 billion in assets under management, 6 billion of which is in office. So with downtown office buildings sitting mostly empty since March, I can imagine you've been busy researching the lasting impacts of this. And I found your recent report called Office Demand in the New Economy Looking Beyond COVID-19, and I can provide a link in the show notes. But this report makes mention of a study you did on the Canadian financial services sector and how structural changes to that industry actually ended up driving more office demand, not less. So can you provide some context on those findings and how that might be relevant for us today?
Yeah, so I think part of what we also do as a group is we tend to look beyond headlines. So the news outlets obviously are a good source of real estate market news and intel, and that can often influence just the views of stakeholders, our own internal teams, clients, and things like that. So we definitely try to do a deep dive to look beyond what you see in like I guess social media post or whatever it is. So and also given that we're a large office owner, as you mentioned, and especially in Toronto, that study was pretty important for us because at that time, back in 2016, 2017, there's a lot of news coming out that the banks were consolidating, and as a result of that, they're going to be shutting off jobs and indirectly the requirements for office space. So we took a step back and we said, let's take a look at the overall banking sector. What's happening structurally? What are some of the drivers of growth, challenges, and really what are they thinking? So what we found was that through the last kind of decade, there definitely were some shifts in Canadian financial services. So the global financial crisis was a big one where as the banks started to go into the crisis, there was a renewed focus on reporting, compliance, insurance, ESG out of that recession. So as a result of that, you saw all the banks, life insurance companies incrementally grow with way more positions in compliance and reporting. The second one was because banking is more traditional, more of a legacy industry. What we also found was because they wanted to kind of innovate like a lot of the technology firms, was the fact that they were rapidly hiring in roles such as software, artificial intelligence, data science, and digital media. So what we found was while there were some traditional wealth management and client retail banking roles being consolidated, they also were rapidly growing in these other sectors. And that was important for office demand. And as a result of that, if you actually look at that report that was done at that time and what's happened to, say, the Toronto office market recently, is there has been such a strong growth in financial services jobs, as well as just in terms of incremental office demand within the downtown core. Drawing parallels to COVID, the reason why we referenced that report was we typically find a lot of change occurs structurally through recessions, and COVID is drawing a similar parallel to what happened during the global financial crisis. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion on work from home and what the impacts are on office demand. But what people also don't realize is the actual process of working from home is driving a lot of change as a result of that from a labor perspective. So we've all gone through, the last couple of months being hunkered down at home, and it's probably changed your consumption patterns. So you're probably consuming digital content more. Maybe it's streaming on Netflix, maybe it's more video games. You're also leveraging digital technology way more, like Teams, Zoom, emails, whatever it is. And you're probably shopping online a lot more as well, just because you haven't been able to go out. So even groceries, as traditional as that is people are buying that online. People are using things like DoorDash, food deliveries, and things like that. So for every incremental growth of those processes is driving more office occupying jobs, right? So you need to have a software engineer create the games, you need to have a film production person actually produce and curate the content that goes onto Netflix or Disney Plus or whatever it is. And in the case of Amazon, they're obviously growing their footprint just because of how rapid e-commerce sales have been. So that is really where we're seeing some growth in these emerging sectors. That's what we highlighted in that research piece. And also because this current downturn is more of a pandemic and a health crisis as well, what we're also seeing is growth in life science, health, research, and ESG sectors as a result of what's happening. So I think in the case of the US, life science clusters are a really big growth for new office demand across a lot of major US markets. And that's definitely one thing that we're seeing. So I think that if you look at the growth of tech out of COVID, the traditional sectors of what we call STEM sectors, so science, technology, education, and media, those definitely are ones that are emerging and are set to continue to grow as a result of just all the structural changes that are happening with COVID and really just the growth of those sectors in advance and leading into COVID.
I mentioned in your bio that you've been involved with NAIOP Vancouver, having been on the board for 3 years, and it was recently announced that you've been selected as president of NAIOP Vancouver for 2021. So congratulations on that, first of all. Reflecting back, what have you gotten out of your involvement with this association, and what are the expectations as far as your new role is concerned?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to take over as president through COVID just because we spent the majority of 2020 in a virtual environment, and I think we likely will be the same in 2021. But we'll definitely see how it goes, and we'll look to continue to maintain the mandate for the organization. I think maybe in terms of the involvement and what I got out of it, I think we're really lucky to be in the industry that we're in. The people are great. It's relatively small and tight knit. And I think our results are often tangible in the sense of the properties that we buy and develop and just the physical change that we, create, across cities. But I also think it's important to not take what we have for granted. And it does require effort and a lot of help and volunteer hours for the industry to maintain the momentum and business networks that we have. So for me, NAIOP was a way to give back in that regard and to really ensure that our industry continues to grow and that we continue to support people that are existing in the industry, but also just entering the industry as well. And I've had a lot of positive experiences through NAIOP and formed, many critical personal and professional relationships through that platform. So I would say in terms of my presidency and my focus, it's really two main things. One is to continue to support our networking efforts through COVID and try to figure out how we navigate the restart of the economy and also just the restart of the industry from a networking perspective. And then the second one is I really do think it's important to mentor and provide educational opportunities for younger people in the industry. So mentorship and our education platform will be two other big industry priorities that we'll look to expand.
Well, a credit to you for stepping up to take this responsibility. It takes a lot of courage to stand up in front of your peers. I mean, I don't know whether it's less so in leading these big Zoom calls, but people are looking at you now as a leader, Anthio. So I'm wondering if you've had a mentor in the industry and what this relationship has done for your career so far.
Yeah, I think I've been lucky to work with so many great people over the course of my career, whether or not it's at DTZ or CBRE or today with my, current company at GWL Realty Advisors. It's tough to name perhaps, one mentor just because I've had so many influential people in terms of guiding my career or supporting my growth. People like Mark Renzoni, Wendy Waters, Steve Marino or Susan McLaren, who I've worked with through the years, have been great at supporting my career growth. I would say if you asked me the last couple of years who a key mentor for me would be, I'd probably have to say Don Harrison, who's the executive vice president at GWL Realty Advisors in charge of client services and whom I work with, directly. He's been there through the many milestones of my career, both good times and bad, as we often kind of laugh at. But probably what's important is that he's also been a champion and has been more than happy to put me in the right meetings at the right time. And for me, because I kind of feel for me, I'm a person I consider myself somewhat balanced. So I really do look to people like Don that provide that balance of really high, leadership, emotional intelligence, active listening, but also balance both professionally and personally as, father, husband. And for me, having young kids at home and having to kind of balance it all, it definitely is good to lean on people that also are able to share similar experiences through their own careers.
And you're right, it's not just the professional advice sometimes, is it? It's just life advice from somebody that's kind of been there and done that. So that's great. Well, looking forward, and I don't know whether you've given much thought about this, but what kind of legacy are you working towards creating in the industry?
I had a good laugh. I loved this question because I had never thought about it before until you asked me. And once I actually took some time to think about it, it actually was pretty clear in terms of perhaps what I wanted to have as kind of my legacy, I guess you could say. So I think at the end of the day, I wanted to be known as someone who made a difference and gave back in a meaningful way. I think you can definitely go through your entire career just focusing on your own career growth, your own progression, own achievements, or whatever it is. But it's also really important in my view to give back, right? Whether that's really helping our clients, for example, achieve their investment objectives, and that's more of a direct outcome in terms of my day to day. But for me, I've really been a big believer in helping younger people get the industry. As a result of that, also increasing the diversity in our industry and the inclusivity of our industry as well. And I think there are so many fantastic people who give back their time in so many ways, whether or not it's through NAIOP or spending time having coffee chats with young people, or even just being a good leader of the office. That I'd rather be known as somebody who does that and has definitely made a difference and has made a meaningful impact on our industry for kind of years to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's great. Well, what advice would you have for anyone starting out in the industry that perhaps you wish you would have known at the time?
Yeah, I think for me, going through the global financial crisis and looking for a job at that point, and then really going through DTZ and CBRE, I kind of felt like I didn't really have a lot to lose. I was relatively unfamiliar with the network, so I really had to kind of start ground up from building my own brand reputation. And so, with that being said, I think that when you're young and when you don't have the same responsibilities as you do when you get older, say with kids and family and other personal obligations, I think putting in the extra time at that point, working hard, spending the hours to network, to get yourself in the right opportunities, working hard but being strategic about it is really critical. There's times where I'll talk to some young people and say, oh, they want to get ahead in their careers, they want to expand and they want to do this, but they're not willing to necessarily put in the time or the strategic time to get ahead. And it's those first couple of years that I think are really critical, because that's when you really start to build your network. That's really when you figure out who you are as a person at your job. And that reputation and that brand perception can really carry yourself through for your future roles. And that definitely has been the case for me, where I really put in the time early on, at CBRE and DZ, and even in my first couple of years at GWL Realty Advisors, to kind of build on my reputation for whatever it was. And that really has helped me with future opportunities down the line. And I also do think that if I reflect back on the business and job opportunities that I've gotten, a lot of that has been through pretty strategic networking. So if you're early on in the industry and there's certain groups or people that you want to work with, I think you should network with them, build relationships, not purposefully to get a job within the next couple of weeks or months, but really build a strong, authentic relationship with them. And often, as long as you're a good person, you work hard, you do good work, those relationships end up driving future opportunities down the line.
Yeah, I think that's very, very good advice. Thank you. Well, getting to know you a little bit more, what's one thing that you're passionate about that people at work may not know about you? And I appreciate you've been at GWL for many years, so they probably know you as well as anyone. But is there anything that, you can share?
Yeah. It's, I guess maybe linking back to my mom as a food writer, I really, I wouldn't say I'm like a foodie, but I really am interested in cooking and food. So our house growing up, and even to this day with family dinners, always filled with, good wine, cooking ideas, recipes, good ingredients. So I definitely say that's one thing that is probably a continued passion of mine. I wish I definitely had more time to cook, but it's been a little bit more difficult with a young family. But every once in a while, I'll sneak off and pick up, some really good ingredients and whip something up nice for myself. And then probably the other thing I guess not a lot of people know is I did play competitive lacrosse, both indoor and outdoor, for many years through college and afterwards, and I'm still pretty involved in that sport. So I definitely say that was another passion of mine for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. Well, wrapping up with five quick fire questions, and I'm going to throw a little curveball here. So, number one,
Yeah.
since you're a chef here, what's your go-to dish if you have to impress? What's the one reserve dish that you can absolutely nail?
Oh, that is a really, really tough one. But I think my colleagues at GWL will have a good laugh at this because they've seen me warm it up at the office from time to time. But I'd say I'm a pretty good maker of soups. So, a lot of kind of roasted vegetable soups, and we'll throw in some of the kind of nicer, I don't know, truffle oils, and we'll do the whole hand blender thing and stuff like that. So I definitely say, I'm a big soup guy. So
Yeah, big soup guy.
as strange as that sounds, right?
Yeah,
So
I like it. Well, number
yeah,
two. So, if you didn't work in real estate, what do you think you'd be doing?
yeah, I'd say if I could survive the hours, I definitely would think of doing something in cooking as a chef. But I'd say probably the other thing was, this is going back to my University of Toronto days, was I did at one point apply to the RCMP. So I did have thoughts of being a police officer. So, long story short, what happened was I had the application in hand for the RCMP, and then also the acceptance letter for U of T. So I kind of had to make a choice of
Oh, interesting.
going into one or the other. So I obviously decided to do the more academic route.
Yeah. Well, if you did go into cooking, you're guaranteed to get some good reviews. Favorite TV show of 2020?
I was never a big series person, but given COVID and obviously we were more hunkered down at home, I did pick up Amazon Prime, so I watched the first two seasons of a show called The Boys, which is a kind of anti superhero show. If you've ever seen it.
No, I haven't. Have to check that one out. And what book have you recently recommended?
I know it's a book called Decisive by the Heath brothers, I believe, and it's a book on business and investment decisions, and it's fantastic because it talks about all the personal biases that people have in business in terms of doing a deal, making a decision or whatever it is. And this talks about how to break down those biases and to make really pragmatic decisions. And given my role, it's just been a fascinating book because they highlight some really good case studies and what some companies did successfully or not so successfully.
Okay, a good recommendation. I have to put a little link to that one, I think, in the notes. Well, last one. Anthio, what's your guilty pleasure?
It's a really simple one, but because we tend to deal with Toronto a lot, I'm up really early and probably even more so now with COVID. So my wife hates me for this, but I do really enjoy a lazy weekend morning sleeping in.
Yeah.
And unfortunately that's harder to come by with the kids, running around the house really early in the morning. But I would say if I could hide away, that would definitely be one guilty pleasure for the weekends.
Fair enough. I'm sure you got lots of Z's to catch up on with a young family.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Anthio, thanks so much for your time and in preparing some great, insightful answers for us here. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. This was a really enjoyable conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers podcast brought to you by Highview Partners, a talent search and recruitment firm focused exclusively on Canadian real estate. If your real estate team is looking to find the best next hire, or if you're ready to make the best next move in your career, then reach out to Highview Partners today. Follow us on LinkedIn and visit us at highviewpartners.ca.